Okay, so now moving on from the basics of stress and strain and stressors, we're going to talk more about types of stressors, specifically applying it to work. Workplace stressors and really all stressors include physical stressors, and in the workplace, these can look at like things like how hot it is, how noisy it is, the smell of the workplace. If you're a garbage person or you work in, a sewage company, you're probably going to experience that one a lot. Um, and the amount and or cleanliness of the workspace. These are some basic ones, but of course, physical stressors can include a number of other things. But these mostly have to do with just how the environment looks and feels to you as the worker. The other one is task stressors, which has to do with your actual work itself, workload, the pace of your work, intensity of the work, and how many hours you work. So these are just some examples, but at work, we specifically usually differentiate physical and task stressors. There's also psychological stressors, of course, which are things like your lack of control or autonomy and decision latitude, and predictability of work. So people tend to be feeling less stressed if they have a lot of control and autonomy in the decisions at the job, and if they know what's going to happen. This is true, of course, even in our everyday life. We all are feeling a lot of stress right now because of uncertainty and a lack of control around the situation. We also have interpersonal conflict as a psychological stressor. So things like issues with your boss, with your people below you, if you're a boss, with your customers and clients. These are things that result in stressor or that can be stressors to you. And I think the interpersonal one may be one of the most common ones that you hear people complain about when they're complaining about stress at work. Usually it has to do with the boss or the clients and customers they're working with. Of course, there's also a lot of people who get stressed because of workload, but definitely interpersonal issues are a big one. Role stressors come from a very big theory of stress, which has to do with role stress theory. And these are defined as stressors that result for the roles you take on or the expectations of you as an employee. And there are different types under those. So specifically, the role stressors that we talk about in the literature the most include role ambiguity, which kind of goes back to that lack of control and predictability. So it's a lack of clarity about what your job is or what is expected of you in your job. So if you are working and you've kind of seen conflicting things or had it all over the place about what is expected of you to perform during the job, you're going to feel a lot of stress because you don't really know in very clear terms what your job role is, and you might do something wrong, but you wouldn't know it. So that's a big one. Another is role conflict, so conflicting demands of the job. And I think a big one that you'll see with this, and especially right now, is safety versus productivity. Sometimes productivity requires that things become or are done quickly, and speed sometimes is counter to safety, and following those types of rules. So employees sometimes are told you got to be fast, you got to be productive, you want to produce quantity, but also you got to be safe, you got to be careful, you want to do quality, and those things can conflict, which can create a lot of stress and tension. And then finally, role overload, which is you have too many roles to fulfill simultaneously. You can't possibly keep up with it. I've definitely experienced this one as a grad student. I'm sure many of you as students have as well, because often we're working many jobs, more than one job on the top of being a full-time student, on top of extracurriculars. That's role overload. And of course, another workplace stressor that we talked about in the previous lecture is work-family conflict, which is when the roles of your role at home versus at work can be in conflict with each other, or the stress from one carries into the other, or they just are affected by each other in some way. Also, emotional labor results in stress. This is a big one for those who work with people specifically in customer service, retail, and service, hospitality, these industries, you have to constantly regulate and control your emotions in order to fulfill a role. And this emotional labor is something that you have to engage in constantly. And for everyone, that's exhausting. But some people actually have kind of a larger capacity to do it than others. And that's where you get into emotional intelligence that we talked about in the Sorting Hat Harry Potter lecture of individual differences. So, this one is a big cause of stress, but we break it down even further than that, like we love to do in psychology, and talk about surface acting compared to deep acting. When you are engaging in emotional labor, so you're with a client or a customer or someone you have to engage with and behave in a really emotionally controlled way, no matter how they're acting, you are acting, right? Because maybe you feel angry or upset, but you have to act like you're in a play and be polite and kind. And surface acting is defined as when you're doing that, but you're very insincere, like you really deep down, you just hate this person, you feel so angry or so upset. The deep acting is when you kind of adjust your mindset even and really fully engage in that role of customer service to where you sincerely want to be polite and kind to this person. And the reason I distinguish between those is because they actually do have different outcomes. So you will see that people who only engage in surface acting, they're drained a lot quicker. They come out of it feeling worse, but people who engage in deep acting usually are able to do emotional labor for longer periods of time and experience fewer stress or strain, I should say, responses at the end as a result of it because they've really actually internalized this more positive attitude. So there are a couple of consequences to stress, of course, and those things are strains that we're talking about. They once you've gotten so stressed, you have kind of limited your resources and you come out the other side with all of these negative outcomes, right? If you're overly stressed. So one behavioral outcome, or I should say a few behavioral outcomes of stress include things like reduced information processing. That's a cognitive issue, but it results in lower memory. Um, that should be a down arrow. Let me fix that. Lower reaction times, and your accuracy is lower as well. So you're going to be making more mistakes. And that goes into cognitive load theory, where your cognitive resources for coping, if you're using them a lot to cope with stress, so you're using your cognition, your brain, to be able to deal with the stress that you're facing. So you're basically putting all of your cognitive energy into coping with stress, and therefore your cognitive energy cannot be used to do information processing anymore. So basically, the theory is that we have a limited number of cognitive resources and we can only direct them into certain things. And when we're in a lot of stress, we're directing a lot of our cognitive resources into coping with that stress. And this can be seen in a lot of other areas of psychology as well, such as discrimination even. We find that people discriminate or are more stereotyping when they are stressed. And that's why things like fear work really well to motivate people to be more discriminatory, because once they're under fear, they're under stress, and that stress will result in them not really wanting to think too much, not to use a lot of information processing. So they'll just go with whatever the first thing they hear or think is. And that's, this theory kind of contributes to why fear is a good mechanism to control people. So I recommend trying not to get too afraid of anything, but also being cautious and trying to make sure that even if you're stressed, you are able to manage and redirect some cognitive resources into information processing. Stress is also found to have, on another note, both a positive and negative relationship with performance. And I mentioned this previously. Sorry, I just hit pause for a second. I, am working from home as are my roommates, so it got a little loud in here and I had to pause for a minute, but I am back. So, um, so more consequences of stress include performance on the job. And I've mentioned this actually I think I mentioned this in like one of my very first lectures that stress actually has both a positive and negative relationship with job performance. And this is because it depends on, of course, it depends on a number of factors, like everything does with psychology, but namely, it depends on how stressed you are. So we call this an inverted U perspective or relationship. So an inverted U meaning an upside down U. So if this is our U, when we turn it upside down, it looks like this. And I'll show you what that looks like, um, this inverted U relationship in with stress and performance. But this comes from the stress as arousal perspective, which just means that, stress is arousal, and arousal is just this heightened state. So in a lot of psychology, we talk about emotions and stress, and pretty much any type of feeling you can have is just being defined as arousal, and arousal being a heightened state, which can be either positive or negative. It could be happy, it could be sad, it could be angry, it could be afraid. It's all arousal. And so if stress is another form of arousal, then that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to always have a negative result if arousal is sometimes positive, right? Now, of course, this seems to be in conflict with um, the one above about how stress reduces your information processing. And the first theory or the first consequence about information processing is more of a linear model. So rather than this inverted U shape I've shown you, it's just, stress, performance goes down. But the second is a nonlinear model, and psychologists are definitely being encouraged more and more to take a lot of our studies and run them through this more linear idea, because maybe the linear relationship exists when you only are cutting out a small portion of it, but when you really look at the broad spectrum, you can see nonlinear relationships. And the most exciting thing about that is that some of the things that we've been studying that we maybe don't find relationships with, we could see a significant relationship if we took a nonlinear approach. And so this is what that nonlinear approach looks like when it comes to stress and performance, and we're talking about arousal. Arousal being stress and performance being here. So when we look at any relationship in our field, we like to specifically put it on these lines, kind of like a scatter, right? And on the y-axis here, the up and down horizontal, we talk about performance. And as you go up, your performance is better. And on the x-axis, this horizontal, it's stress. And as you go toward the right, stress is higher. So what you see with this inverted U shape is that if stress is really low, too low, because it's arousal, you have absolutely no, energy or motivation. You're not in a heightened state, so you're not performing. But if stress goes up a bit, you will actually see that your performance goes up because you feel, remember that definition of stress as pressure or tension, you are pressured to perform. So stress will actually result in higher performance up to a certain point. And then once it hits a certain point, something else happens where it's kind of like that flow state of meeting that challenge to your skill or the stress to performance balance, right? So you after this point, and stress just becomes too much, and you get into that fight, flight, freeze, negative, counterproductive response, and then all of a sudden your performance starts to plummet. So that's really important to think about how this relationship might work. And I think it makes a lot of sense intuitively, but as psychologists, we often forget to look at these more complicated relationships. Let's move on to more consequences of stress. We talked about those behaviors. One that we really need to address is the psychological consequences of stress. And the main thing that we talk about in the workplace when it comes to psychological consequences of stress is burnout. And I'm sure you've all heard this term before. Burnout is defined as an extreme state of psychological strain that results from a prolonged response to chronic job stressors that exceed an individual's resources to cope. So remember, we need to cope. We need to take a coping approach, whether emotion focused or problem focused, whenever we have stress. But when there are just nonstop stressors and they exceed your ability to cope, kind of going back into this U, that's where the line changes. And these stressors far exceed how much you can cope and your resources. your cognitive, psychological, or even physical resources, then you will just be in a prolonged state of strain, and eventually you reach burnout. Burnout is an unfortunate outcome for a lot of people at work, and is made up of three factors. First is emotional exhaustion, and that's when you feel just completely drained by work. Just the thought of even going into work or doing work makes you feel like you want to take a nap. I don't know if you've experienced it that way, but I sure have. The second factor of burnout is depersonalization, and sometimes called cynicism, which is where you kind of feel detached or negative towards your job. And you might even start treating your clients or your coworkers or whatever, like not even as people. You're just completely disengaged. And finally, low personal accomplishment, which is where you feel that you can't deal with your problems at work effectively. And you don't feel like you are accomplishing anything at work anymore. You just feel this very negative feeling towards your abilities and how you're able to achieve things. And you also don't identify with others very well. So it's kind of a form of reduced state self-efficacy. These things, if you'll pay attention to them, if you notice, they actually sound a lot like depression. So we could maybe say it's almost like a form of job-focused related depression. It's most often measured using Maslow's burnout inventory, but there are a lot of other measures of burnout. So, they all, as long as they're validated by studies, there are a lot of ways to study it. And it's also characterized as the opposite of engagement, which is interesting because we talked about engagement last time with the attitudes and emotions topic, which is also kind of related to motivation. And you want to see how burnout is the opposite of engagement. If you remember, burnout is made up of three, as you can see here, factors, and engagement was also made up of three factors. So the study from Gonzalez Roma in 2006 actually looked at these three factors of both of these constructs and looked to see if there is a really clear relationship there. So if you remember, engagement was made up of these three things: vigor, dedication, and absorption. And burnout, of course, is made up of these three things: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, or cynicism, and low personal accomplishment. What this study actually found was that these two, or four, I should say, these specific factors were actually related to each other almost as opposite ends of spectrums, where vigor and emotional exhaustion are along this kind of energy continuum, and dedication and depersonalization or cynicism are across the identification continuum. So, if you have high levels of energy, you're vigor. If you're really identifying with your job, you're dedicated. Whereas on the other hand, if you're low energy, you're exhausted. If low identification, your cynicism is high or you're personalized. The other ones, the third, they don't really relate to each other, but it is interesting to see that these are characterized broadly as kind of opposite of each other. Okay. Moving forward to other consequences of stress. Just like with the example I gave of kind of being like exhausted physically from working your body with your muscles, moving boxes or whatever it may be, there are going to be physiological responses to stress. Even if that stress is purely at work or psychological, you're still going to experience some physical responses. These include release of stress hormones. Most commonly, we talk about cortisol as our main stress hormone, but it can include other neurotransmitters and hormones as well. Also see cardiovascular responses, such as your heart rate going up. And then we also will see shrinking blood vessels. You don't need to know all these details, but interesting how we have a lot of physiological responses. Increased breathing, and gastrointestinal problems, so stomach aches and pains, cramps. People even have had, serious issues in their health that are due to stress, because your body can develop like a cyst or a hernia or a ulcer from stress. So it's interesting to know that taking care of stress, even if it's purely psychological, will take care of your physical health as well. So sometimes that's a lot easier said than done, and I recognize that. Something that contributes a lot to stress at work that we are discovering through research is work schedules. Specifically, something like shift work, which is scheduling of work in temporal shifts, such as in hospitals. This is like namely the main place that this happens. So it's necessary to do shift work for essential services, things that need to be functional 24/7. So emergency services and hospitals, especially right now. However, unfortunately, this shift work has negative implications for our circadian rhythm. And humans operate on a circadian rhythm, which is that 24-hour physiological cycle. And we, by nature, no matter how much we try not to be, are inclined to want to be active when it's light and inactive when it's dark. That's just how we are by nature biologically. And disturbing the circadian rhythm, so that includes engaging in shift work, will cause negative health rate responses, negative performance, and negative satisfaction with the job. So unfortunately, these necessary services have really bad implications for the workers who have to do them because they are going to experience these outcomes as a result of the shift work. On the other hand, if you have a fixed shift or you're permanently assigned to a particular shift, you are probably going to be a little bit more okay, even if it's a shift that's more at the nighttime. Um, Although the best shift to have is going to be your average daytime shift. We just operate better that way. Um, and then, of course, there's rotating shifts, which are when you move from shift to shift over a certain period of time. And rotating shifts lead to impaired circadian rhythms, which have even higher detrimental outcomes. When we're talking about shift work, basically the best one to have is a fixed shift during the day. The second best would be probably a fixed shift at night or non-normal hours. However, a rotating shift where you're constantly changing is going to have the most detrimental outcomes. In a lot of these jobs, the people who are assigned different shifts, it's based a lot of times on seniority or tenure. So take that as you will. Maybe it's good, maybe it's kind of like I did my time. Now the younger, newer employees have to do it as well. But definitely something that any government or organization that has to employ people in these types of strange hours is going to have to take into consideration when thinking about their workers' health and well-being. I mentioned this before a little bit, that flexible work hours are one way that employers can reduce stress. Individuals giving or being given discretion over the time that they report to work and the time they leave work can result in a lot of positive outcomes because it results in them feeling that they have more control over their jobs and decision latitude and autonomy. They just feel in charge. And this means that they are going to be more productive and they're going to have less absenteeism. There's also a compressed work week, which schedules, or it's a schedule that permits workers to work more hours but fewer days a week. So maybe 10 hours, 4 days a week type of thing. And then telecommuting, which I mentioned in the last one. And most of these, as I went into, and so I won't go into it again, but I went into it during the last lecture, they have a lot of positive outcomes for workers, again, especially for women. But the world is changing and these things are becoming not only more common, but sometimes required as they are right now. So it'd be interesting to see the implications of these types of events on how flexible work hours actually help or hurt. And briefly, I just want to mention measures of stress. You can measure it a number of different ways. Probably most often we just ask people, are you feeling stressed? How do you appraise your stress? But of course we can do those measures, those psychological questions or physiological measures. Remember I mentioned skin response, heart rate, breathing, hormones, cortisol, and some Some people are able to measure those things, but more common, we just ask people to self-report how stressed they are. Makes it easier for us as researchers because it can be difficult to really strap someone in and measure these responses. In a perfect world, you would want to have both because there is merit to both people's physiological responses, but also how they report feeling, because most people are being honest in these situations, and sometimes there's not always a match between physiological and psychological response, and that is worth noting as well. Um, but on that note, feel free to, go to the forums, talk about what you think about these issues we discussed, or go ahead to the next video, which will be on stress theories, and I will see you over there.